This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, MICHAEL COVEL. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. Put aside any one election. Today, Americans don't trust each other. There are two sides, two angry sides. There are legitimate ideological conflicts. There is a hardened partisanship. Everyone around the world can see this. Now look, I have my perspective. I want the government out of my bedroom. I want the government out of my pocketbook to the greatest extent that I can. I believe firmly that a belief in the modern day American government at the local, county, state, and federal level is crazy. We're not at war, and the vast majority of debates in America behind the scenes are really about all these government jobs. People are voting their jobs. That's my perspective. My guest today, Kevin Vallier, goes into this issue of trust in a polarized age. We try our very best, and I don't know every one of Kevin's positions, but we try our very best to present all of the perspectives, to try to get somewhere, to get to some kind of an understanding. Now look, I just lay out my bias from the outset. Those are my beliefs. But if you listen to this podcast, you know that I have on this show liberals, conservatives, and libertarians, and probably all kinds of other people that I don't even know about. And the trick to doing an interview, the trick to making it good, is to give everyone a fair shake. Because if I just walk out there with my opinions and try to ram it down a guest's throat, it doesn't work. This is all about a conversation. At the end of the day, I do think most people believe in the ideal that you wake up each day, you work hard, and that's it. A merit system is the best system. That's ultimately capitalism. Ultimately, the system that has brought more people out of poverty than anything else. But again, as my guest today, Kevin Vallier, goes into, this trust aspect between both sides, it's broken. Without any further delay, let's get into that brokenness and have a nice conversation with Kevin Vallier. In advance of this call, Kevin, I said to myself, there's a little bit of that kind of angst feeling like, is this going to be combative? Is half the audience going to tune out? Is half the audience going to love it? You get all these feelings going through, and you must know this because you live at this intersection of where you clearly, from a career standpoint, want to be right in the middle of really hot button perspectives and insights, yeah?
Yeah, well, and as many of them as I can be, because the sort of point of the project is to try to bring the temperature down a little bit. So yeah, putting myself in the line of fire in a variety of ways.
Bringing the temperature down, it's an interesting thought. Obviously, the temperature going back, probably, I could say America had some unity throughout World War II. The 50s were looking nice. JFK, many people believe, would not have gone into Vietnam. And then once he was killed, what happened next in Vietnam probably has set the stage for the kind of division and temperature rising that has continued up until this point in time.
Vietnam mattered, civil rights movement mattered, abortion and women's rights mattered. Really, the late 60s and early 70s, a lot of events that I don't think are in any way logically linked together, but that are historically linked together, put pressure on trust and common sense in the U.S., created mistrust between a variety of different groups because there are a lot of people kind of challenging the status quo. One thing in particular that was going on was distrust with the Vietnam War between generations, whereas older generations tended to be supportive and younger people didn't. I mean, one of the hippies' slogans that people have forgotten was "Don't trust anyone over 30." It's also the case around that time that trust in government starts to fall, and it's just kept falling. But during 9/11 and the Iraq War, it went up a bit. But really, with the exception of that trend, things have been really falling apart, not completely linearly, but that's the overall pattern.
The war point is an important one, and it's interesting about the older because clearly once we found out, as time went on and we found out what was actually going on behind the scenes with LBJ and Nixon, we kind of, even the older people would have been a little bit like, okay, this is not good. But put that aside, the notion of starting a war that really did not need to be started, for example, Vietnam, for example, Iraq, these events, you sometimes want to imagine life if those two things didn't happen.
Yeah. I mean, it's hard to know exactly. I mean, I think one thing that happened that a lot of people haven't really paid attention to some aspects of, but was that the parties became more aligned with the different cultures in the U.S. starting in the 60s, but down to the 80s and 90s, because the South was so uniformly Democratic that the Republican Party didn't even have basic party infrastructure throughout most of the South, even well into the 60s. With the Southern realignment that Nixon began, I don't just sort of say, well, I mean, yes, he did play on certain racial sentiments, but one of the things that happened is that the Republican Party started to build up infrastructure to actually run candidates in the South. Southern culture's more religious, it's more traditional in various ways, and then, of course, there's the legacy of racism. And this helped to create, I think, a kind of public manifestation of difference, particularly red-blue difference, that did not really exist before then. And it took a while to complete. I mean, really from Nixon on down to Reagan before it was really locked in. So I think that's another thing that's happened. But a lot of people don't realize that you essentially had one-party rule in the South for a long time.
Here's where it can probably get a touch controversial as we dive in. And I think what you just described, okay, I think most people, even if they're on the left or the right, they would say that's a reasonable perspective. But then I think people on the right might start to say, okay, America's gotten more divided. And then the question might become, why? If I would listen to my friends on the right, many of them would say, and you're hearing this messaging in modern times right now, they would say, well, gosh, okay, we had all this strife in the 60s. We have the civil rights movement. LBJ gets a bunch of stuff passed. And then we roll forward 40 years in American cities are dominated by one-party rule, a lot of violence and a lot of stuff that now we have a big discussion in America about the unfortunate aspects of police crossing the line. But from a statistical standpoint, that is low. But the overall crime that takes place in American inner cities is high. Well, yeah, I think you make a valid point that, okay, Nixon goes down this path, but then why? And I think if I was to listen to my friends from the right, a lot of them are just like, gosh, I don't want to go to downtown DC if I live in Northern Virginia. It just doesn't feel safe.
I think that's actually a pretty fair point. I've actually been doing some research with some economists on the relationship between trust in most people and trust in the legal system. I think that people tend to see policemen as more trustworthy. In almost every country in the world, people trust the police more than they do most people. But those numbers are proportionate. So as trust in the police goes up, trust in most people goes up, and vice versa. We've been trying to figure out why that is. Part of our hypothesis is that the police are seen as kind of exemplary community members in most communities. The problem that we face, I think, with a lot of policing is there's been a lot more scrutiny on their actions, and I think it's having all kinds of divisive consequences. Now, one thing that I've stressed in some of my conversations that I've had with people about this is that you don't want to defund the police, because we know that having lots of cops tends to reduce crime. They just don't need to be anywhere near as violent or use the same tactics. There's a lot of good evidence that if you have a lot of observation, policemen on the beat, it can help. And people in those inner city communities actually want the police around. They just don't want them busting heads. It's very important that we promote the trustworthiness of the police so that we can trust them. The end goal of reform, I think, is for everyone to be able to trust each other a little bit more, right? And to have that, you've got to have a little bit more trustworthiness. So the goal of police reform in inner cities should be to create more trustworthy police, not to cast them under suspicion, not to abolish them, and not to give them carte blanche to do whatever they want. That's kind of a lot of my work and thinking, is to try to reorient us to saying, okay, look, we've got these problems where people don't trust institutions, and then to say, well, what would it take for us to come to trust each other more? How would our institutions and policies need to change? So I think we have to bear that in mind.
That's a great point in the sense that what really bothers me in the last handful of months is, yes, we can all agree the videos, terrible. The actions look terrible. Now, of course, these cases have not been adjudicated yet. We might find out more information. This often happens. But what really bothers me is the media, in the sense that a certain case is selected, a certain case is amplified, and it's amplified like it's on steroids. So then you have suburban folks out in the suburbs. They're not really following what's going on. Then they see the one video that's pushed at them nonstop 24/7. And those same suburban folks are not necessarily asking themselves, okay, what's that in context? Is that happening every day, or is that happening once in a blue moon? And then those same suburban folks are probably not asking, what kind of crime is actually going on in these communities, and what are the police having to deal with? It just seems like we get to this point of one video run 24/7, and there's nothing else, and it makes us as Americans look like emotional basket cases.
Yeah, I think that's right. Actually, I've only really just started paying attention closely to media ecosystem modeling, the way that interacts with media trust. One of the troubling things, of course, is that the media can amplify something that's false, and they can undermine trust in an institution as a result when it isn't warranted. That is, when most people in the institution are trustworthy, and people, that's the availability heuristic, that bias that we have towards just whatever we can see and detect, as opposed to all the things that we don't see. You would ideally want some kind of media ecosystem that would represent things more accurately. But I'm still learning about media policy and ways, patterns of reform, so that people would get a more accurate sense of what's going on. One thing that I have learned is that people tend to trust local media and local politicians more than national media and national politicians. And I do think if you watch your local news, they do tend to be a little bit less sensationalistic, a little less glitzy and obsessed, and a little bit less polished and a more like us. Things I think that would sort of get people to focus a little bit more on their local communities might be some good incentives, so we don't have these things blow up the whole countrywide, and there's someone in Montana worried about a problem that's a problem in Washington, D.C.
In your work, your newest book, you get very granular, very detailed. I would say also for the average reader, it's very academic. I mean, you're getting into the fine weeds. I did notice one thing, and I want you to comment on it, and this could ultimately get us into some controversy, is that you're very pragmatic, and I see you shaping the perspective and the view from both sides. I see that. I'm not denying that's clearly in your work. You talk about right-wing populism, left-wing populism. You talk about the pros and cons. You look at it from different angles. However, I did note in going through your work, I wanted to find what I would call the controversial moments or the hot button examples that you used. I do think that if my right-wing friends were going through your work, they might say to themselves, the few examples that Kevin picked, for example, talking about maybe Republicans moving farther right, talking about the Brett Kavanaugh example, mentioning Fox News, or mentioning that Trump has family members working for him, that some on the right might say, well, Kevin seems pretty even-handed, but he picked these examples that would lead me to believe he doesn't support my side.
Yeah.
Did I get you?
The point of all this is sort of not to reveal what team I'm on, because as soon as I do, people stop listening, kind of wanting to tell you the places where I agree with people on the right, because actually one of the things that I'm trying to do is reach what is going to by and large be a left-wing audience at a kind of higher level of abstraction. So one of the things that I'm doing is, like in chapter 6, one of the things that I do is I try to go very carefully through some problems with going to the left of the ordinary welfare state. I just spend a lot of time saying, like, here are all the difficulties. So a lot of my left-wing readers will nod at this particular cases, but then if you look at the defenses that I have of things like the market and limited government, and the things I say about, yeah, you can justify some welfare programs, but not all that many, because it's really hard to balance the cost and benefits, then I think folks on the right are going to say, okay, all right, now I see where he's trying to be. I'm trying to get my reader to say, look, clearly that he's not on board with the populism. He's worried about populism. He's worried about corruption. And maybe I should have thrown in some cases about Venezuela just to make that more forceful, but I'm so focused on the US. So right now, left-wing populism isn't that powerful compared to right-wing populism. But if it were the reverse, then I would be hitting them.
Let me keep it at that for a moment. A couple of these examples really quick, and I want to move into some of the welfare state discussion. But for example, just for those readers that might go into the detail, since you do make the point, you say, well, gosh, okay, Trump brought family members into the highest reaches of government. And I was looking for balance on that and didn't see it in the sense that I know, okay, JFK sort of put his brother in as AG. Bill Clinton sort of gave the healthcare system to his wife. And again, I've written books, so I know we can't get everything perfect. But I mean, would you agree with me that there is, at the highest reaches of government, there is absolutely some nepotism that goes on both sides?
I think so. I mean, I think that Trump represents a certain kind of new degree and brazenness of it that's just so public and manifest and unapologetic, particularly with the role that like Ivanka and Jared Kushner are playing. One of the things that I wanted to do, because this book is coming out this year, was to talk about the cases that would be most vivid, because I think these are things that Republicans are pre-Trump would have been just as worried about as anybody. And I think a lot of Republicans are worried about corruption because they see, the relationship between Joe Biden and Hunter Biden as a big problem. The thought was you hit the people in power because they're the ones actually causing these issues now. But yeah, I mean, if you said, hey, do a history of presidential corruption and the kinds of public corruption that you think have hurt trust, with Nixon, it was really hurt. You have the tapes and you have a whole lot of the details of coming out when you have a earlier period of time where people just didn't know that much about what presidents were doing behind closed doors. I mean, if people knew half the stuff that we know now that JFK was doing behind closed doors, I mean, this is way worse than what Trump has done. I mean,
in terms of tapes behind the scenes, people need to go to UVA's Miller Center and listen to LBJ because this guy probably wins the cake.
Woo! Yeah, no, if you look into anything about his sort of personality, he's the sort of case where you don't want to look under the hood of democracy too much. You don't want to see how the sausage is made, so to speak, because he was a master at getting people to actually coordinate and to pass legislation, but in a way that we would think was very problematic today.
I think it's an interesting point because it gets into trust in kind of a side tangent sort of way. And I think it opens up to a bigger issue, which we don't know the full story yet. Let's talk about Trump and the family. Let's talk about perhaps what his motivations are. I'm going to guess that Trump's motivations for family were based on trust. I'm going to guess that he felt like people don't properly think about how much of an outsider this guy was. He literally had no GOP establishment on his side. He basically just threw his hat in the ring and won. Now, if he was at the local level or if it was not a partisan country, most people would say, my gosh, that is so cool that in America you can still be an outsider, throw your hat in the ring and win the presidency. But given how divided we are, we don't really have time to reflect on that. But I think what's interesting about the family and Trump is it opens up another aspect of trust for me. You could be completely right. I don't know here in terms of the family and the nepotism and whatnot. But I'm guessing that when he got into that system and he was exposed to some of the inner workings and he had meetings with, for example, the FBI, et cetera, and all those things and how that all started to unfold. And then within short order, all those people that were the neutral arbiters, the people that were supposed to be law enforcement neutral, all of a sudden you got the Comey, the Clapper, the Brennan, all on TV. From a trust perspective, I never wanted to see the FBI leader on TV taking partisan positions. I don't want to see that. I want the FBI guy to be neutral. I want my DA to be neutral. I don't want to know what their politics are. We've crossed that line going forward into the future, both parties forever. Yes or no?
It's a really big problem. I don't really know how that particular difficulty can be put back where it is. I mean, just think about back to George W. Bush. The right had total trust in these people. They were seen, particularly like when Bob Mueller came around, the thought was like, oh, look, this is like a Republican, like the Republicans will have to respect him. Trump does hit him really hard, but in the end, I mean, when he actually talked to the press and everything, he just seemed so kind of disunified and unfocused that it was sort of like, well, we thought this guy was like this extraordinary professional individual, and then he actually talks, and it's like, what were the people under him doing? Maybe some of these people were, really just trying to get Trump for partisan reasons. So the way a lot of these guys have come off just on TV, they've been partisan or they've seemed disconnected.
Not good for trust.
No, because you want people to be able to trust these institutions. Now, of course, what I care the most about is people being able to trust most other people. You don't want to trust government completely. It's a large concentration of power, and it's going to misbehave if you don't ever question it. But you want trust to be tracking trustworthiness. You don't want to trust people that aren't trustworthy. It doesn't ever pay to be a sucker. A lot of what the book is focused on is how to reform institutions so as to make them more trustworthy, so actual trust would be warranted. But then when you have the leaders of these institutions go out and say, look, half the country, the guy you voted for is terrible. Maybe we should get rid of him, even though you elected him and we didn't. Sorry, you elected him rather than these people. It's just not a good look for democracy. I mean, one of the big difficulties that we have had in our politics is that we should be skeptical of experts, but not terribly skeptical. Because a lot of times experts will say, look, I know how this process is going to go, or I can make the institution do this or achieve this goal. And they just can't because they're just not that good, or they don't have the right incentives, or they just don't have the right information available. So you want some skepticism of experts. My view right now is that on the left, there's, I think, a little bit too much, and on the right, there's way too little with respect to a whole variety of different issues. That'll change if it's in charge because trust is polarized.
This one example in the name, not to go down personalities too much, but he really inserted himself back in 2016 into the election. That'd be Jim Comey. And he did things that probably caused both sides to just pull their hair out. I mean, he did things that no other FBI director had ever done, clearly on some kind of a power trip of some sort. But now we have a situation where a former FBI director, and I guess, okay, yes, a lot of people had problems with Hoover and all that kind of stuff, and he was there for the inception of the FBI, but I don't think we had what happened under Comey. And now we're at a situation where the former FBI director, and I don't know how much the appreciation for Comey is on the left, meaning I don't know how intense their like of him is, but I can say on the right, if you bring up the name Comey, I think there's literally below pond water. I mean, it's like the view of this man and how he's unfolded things. And I just can't understand how he didn't see that. If I'm in his shoes, he apparently is so disgusted and so freaked out about Trump that he thought that he needed to use bureaucratic powers to hurt him. You just think, well, hold on, the election's every 4 years. What was this guy going to do? There's 3 branches of government. It just seems like something spun out of control.
It's a difficult dynamic because one of the sort of features of populisms, left or right, is a sort of deep distrust of experts. The problem with the United States in the sort of first decade of the 21st century was that elites failed. They got us into a dumb war.
Iraq.
Yeah, in Iraq.
That was on Republican watch primarily, of course.
The Democrats went along with it.
Yeah, they did.
Joe Biden went along with it. And then the financial crisis, and I think a lot of people felt like people dropped the ball on that too. The thought was, well, look, our trust in experts isn't as warranted. People's trust in government's falling, and so people think, look, we need someone to come in and drain the swamp, clean house or whatever. This is actually not uncommon across the world, that populism does relatively well when trust in government's relatively low. I just want to make clear to folks who are listening is it isn't just a problem with Trump. My view with right-wing populism is that it's self-defeating. People send populists in there to clean house and make government work better, but the people they send don't actually make it work better. But that's true on the left as well. I mean, you can just look in Latin America for legions of such cases. I mean, that's kind of the idea, is that we have to focus on certain concrete reforms with a good track record and certain kinds of institutional practices, particularly making government reliable and predictable and comprehensible to most people, that you can't solve just by electing an outsider. Because the thing about Trump is, for all the stuff that he said and all the stuff that people said he was going to do, he hasn't done that much relative to what people are saying. And I don't think there's anyone who could think, with the maybe exception of the COVID crisis, if they're really prepared to blame him for everything, which I don't think you can, he's way less bad than people were saying, like his critics were saying he was going to be.
That's a great point. I keep looking for the things that he's done that are the Nazi accusations. Whether I see a couple conservative Supreme Court justices, okay, that's typical under Republican presidents, just as it is under Democratic presidents. Your outsider point is really interesting. Let's explore that for a second, because I personally love the idea that an outsider can throw his hat in the ring. I think it's worth talking about why an outsider fails in the American system. From my perspective, the reason that an outsider fails is a really sad reason. And I grew up in the Washington, D.C. area, most of my life there. 6 of the top 10 wealthiest counties in the United States of America surround D.C. Those 6 counties vote overwhelmingly Democrat. Most of my family lives in Fairfax County, Virginia, okay? We're talking 70 to 80% blue. Now, here's what's interesting. These are not, even though they're 70 to 80% blue, they're not voting for Portland politics. What they're voting for are their jobs.
Yeah, because they get so much government largesse.
Right. And so what's interesting is that if you're an outsider on the right coming into the presidency and you are thrown into the middle of whether one wants to call it the bureaucracy or the deep state, you're going to have a hard time doing a damn thing.
That's right, particularly because our electoral institutions were designed not to pass very much legislation. I mean, that was part of the founders' point, was the thought is, look, we separate powers. We have 2 houses of Congress because we want the people to be very sure about what they're doing when something gets passed. Because their view was you didn't want to just pass whatever was in the will of the people at this second. You wanted to pass what was the considered judgment of the people as a whole. So they created a government that would operate slowly. That makes it very hard to change things relative to other democracies. That means an outsider has a whole heck of a lot of trouble unless he knows how to build big coalitions. One of my hopes for Trump coming in was that he didn't seem especially ideological. And I don't think that he is. And so my thought was, oh, wow, we actually got someone who isn't that much of an ideologue in office. Maybe he can do something necessary like an infrastructure bill. And I thought, look, a guy who was in business, he's had to work with a lot of different kinds of people. Maybe he would be able to reach out to Democrats and get along with them. He didn't want to change Social Security, didn't want to change Medicare or Medicaid. What exactly happened? A nice thing about an outsider is that they aren't on the sort of necessarily the polarized policy perspective.
I think once the investigation was thrown at him, though, clearly all we talked about for 2 to 3 years was Mueller. When it happened, what do we get out of it? I'll let you run with this. Perhaps you can give some historical context. I think what's interesting about both parties, and I want you to comment on both parties, is we don't necessarily think about how different the Reagan-Bush side of things, how different those two are. On the Bush side, you would have your McCain, your Romney, some more moderate senators. Trump probably falls more under the outsider Reagan perspective. Reagan was not exactly an insider.
No. I'm
going to let you comment on that. And then also to follow up, let you comment also what's unfolding on the Democratic side, because I think the last election, the last nominating process on the left, Clinton and Bernie, this is the real divide there. And we're still seeing that play out every day because these young people protesting in Portland, they're not protesting because they support Trump or Biden.
The interesting thing about the younger generation is when you break down people's trust levels by age, that the youngest generation, 18 to 29, they're the least trusting group that we've ever seen in the polling in the United States. They don't trust anything. A lot of them are willing to burn everything down and loot and do all of this stuff because they just think everyone's against them. They haven't had any kind of unifying social event. They've just seen division and hatred and strife and dysfunction for most of their lives. But to comment on the Reagan thing, I mean, he was governor of California. It was interesting because, he was pro-choice when he was governor, been divorced, which on the right was a kind of a big deal at that time. He was part of Hollywood, so there are various ways in which he was kind of more on the left in a certain kind of way earlier on. He was a Democrat. He said the Democrats left him. In that sense, he was an outsider in terms of like how free market, limited government he was. But he'd been coming up the ranks within the party for a while. Trump had been interested in politics for a long time. He actually ran on the Reform Party for the nomination against Pat Buchanan, attacking a lot of the policies that he came to adopt. I actually think of him as sort of glitzy Pat Buchanan. They have very similar political views: war, foreign policy, trade, everything. Yeah, I mean, I think that Trump is an outsider in a weird way because he had never held elected office before. I mean, it was, so I think it's more radical than it is for Reagan. I think it's precisely because people thought, look, things have been going so badly. Let's roll the dice. I mean, what was the line on the right about this? Look, I don't know what Trump is going to do, but I know what Hillary is going to do, and I don't like it. That's what people said. I knew a lot of people in my church, for instance, that were saying, look, I mean, I don't know what Trump's going to do, but I know what Hillary's going to do, and I can't stomach that.
I think the right voters looked at that stage when there was 8 Republicans standing up there with Trump in the middle. They looked at that stage and they said, all those people telling us how great they are as Republicans, et cetera, all those people supported the Iraq war, and we don't want that.
And they supported trade policies that are unpopular among most people. I'm a free trader, but I know that there are better and worse ways to do it. And I know there are better and worse policies that will actually help people transition due to all the creative destruction that's unleashed. I am a free trader, but I think there's a point in saying, look, there's different ways of distributing the costs. And we haven't done a great job of that. I think a lot of the Scandinavian countries do a better job than we do because they're so small, they have to rely on trade, but they've had to handle a lot of disruption. So they've had more time to adjust in a certain way. The people are saying, look, you gave us the war. You gave us NAFTA, pro-immigration with Rubio. That was one of the things that was the issue, was he and McCain had been the Republicans with this reform. Everyone after 2012 was saying, look, Republicans have to get Hispanics on their side. Republicans have to get Hispanics on their side. And they were going to pass this immigration reform like they tried to do at the end of W's second administration. And the Republicans just said no. There was a way in which the average Republican voter and the average Republican politician were not in sync. And now they're more in sync than they were before Trump.
Why is nationalism bad? I'm not calling you from the States today. I happen to be in Vietnam. Even if people have differing political opinions in a place like Vietnam or China, you and I know they don't get the chance to vote as we do. However, I do find in my travels, that most countries have a certain nationalism. It's often manifested in their football team, which is really interesting to me, you know?
Yeah, yes, that's
but
right.
People really love their countries. This part, I've seen the word nationalism under Trump become something of a boogeyman and something awful. But nationalism in America used to be the guy in Kansas with a mowed lawn putting his flag up each day. That used to not be a bad thing. But now, again, back to the young kids, I see the young kids running around with hammers and sickles and Shea t-shirts. I'm trying to figure out in my mind, why is it bad to be like, I'm an American? Is America supposed to be the UN? All the other countries around the world get to be nationalistic. Why can't America be nationalistic?
I distinguish between patriotism, love of country. Nationalism that I see is more sort of exclusivist in the sense that it's like, look, we're good and the others are bad. Now, there are certain times that nationalism is actually a very functional framework, particularly when you have to unite people against an external threat. The worry that I have is with nationalism in peacetime, because the idea is someone has to construct what the nation is. They have to say, look, this is who the real America is. And that doesn't always fit everybody. In fact, it usually doesn't fit everybody. You ultimately have to say, these people are the real America and then these people aren't. And that creates an in-group, out-group, a kind of tribal phenomenon that I think undermines trust. However, during World War II, nationalism was a huge trust builder. We all figured out, or as they said in the UK, everyone did their bit. Everyone pitched in, everyone cooperated. I think if you're fighting a war, there are conditions under which nationalism can be good. In our current condition, I think it's a temptation to construct a certain group as the real America, and then as a certain group within the country, the real America, as the non-real America. So that's the thing I kind of worry about with nationalism, is the nationalism in its present sort of context.
Now, on the flip side, if I was to go over to the other aisle, because we could say, okay, perhaps the right is doing exactly what you just said. But if I look at the left, I'm seeing things in the last handful of years. And I knew that when Bruce Jenner changed his, however he defines it, I don't want to say anything because, God, I don't know. This is the part of the problem right here. Is it?
You don't know the norms. What do you say?
The word fights, right? But if I look at the left now, the left has created a situation where there's silos on race, gender, identity, and the left expects people on the right to immediately, because a group of academics developed critical race theory or white privilege, that they expect everyone on the right to just go, oh yeah, this is, on the left side, there's a lot of things going on that was not helping to create any sense of unity at all.
I agree completely. My very first book was all about how the left has the wrong approach to religion and politics. all kinds of different ways in terms of what we can talk about, in terms of religious exemptions. I've been a really big defender of religious exemptions in terms of the cases like Hobby Lobby, Little Sisters of the Poor, things like school choice that allow religious parents more options. I think the main group that the left can't handle is people of faith, in part because they are descendants of a kind of more radical progressivism that saw history as progress, in a scientific, rational progress away from certain kinds of superstition. So among many left-wing elites, the thought is like, all those religious people, they're just about to go away. If we could just fight a little bit longer, they're going to go away, or they're going to stop caring, and it's going to be just like it is in Sweden. It's going to be like Star Trek. Everybody looks different but thinks the same. That's the kind of diversity that you're all too often presented with on the left, the hostility to talking about viewpoint diversity. What I like to say is I think the deep problem in American politics right now among elites is that the left wants obedience, and the right wants blood.
The right would be saying, hold on, we're not doing anything close to the violence that we're seeing in Portland, Chicago, New York, etc. That is real blood. They are absolutely blooding up the whole country.
Remember what everyone says on the right about Trump. I love that he's a fighter. I love that he's finally standing up for us. That's what I mean by blood. I don't mean actual spilling of blood.
Okay. So that's the left.
The left is saying that, look, here are our norms. Obey. If you dissent because you have a different view about sexual morality or something like that, you're unreasonable, you don't believe in equality, you're out. On my view, that's also trust destroying. The difficulty with the way that a lot of identity politics is done, I think it can be done well, but it's often done very poorly, is again, you're saying these are the good people, and over here are the bad people, and you can't trust the bad people. And that's what I want to fight against in every way. I think many people on the right think, and what I meant by the right wants blood is what I mean is they want someone to say to the left, hey, we're not going to take it anymore. We're not going to listen to you. We're not going to obey. We're going to do everything we can to transgress your norms, to violate your taboos. That's why I think the problem on the right is that many people on the right have lost sight of a kind of more positive vision. They're so angry with the left, all the kind of policing and condescension and everything like that, that I think the right have kind of lost sight of the way that Reagan was stronger than Trump. Reagan could give you a positive vision. And I think that's Trump's biggest weakness as a politician is he's a really hard time doing that. He's never going to win in the way that Reagan did in terms of really big numbers because that's just not his forte. His forte is defining his opponents, nullifying all of their traditional forms of attack. Even if he loses, he will have been more successful in terms of rebutting and undermining certain things on the left than just about anybody. I see Trump as a kind of street fighter. And I think that's what a lot of people like about him.
A couple points to some of the things you said. You brought up the left perspective on religion. What's really interesting is the black vote in the South is highly religious.
That's right. That's right. Particularly African-American women are the most religious ethnic gender minority that there is, but they're the most overwhelmingly Democrat as well.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing there. Also, too, I think from a white man perspective, and you and I are both very guilty because we are white men, that's part of the problem. The typical white male, I would say almost at 100%, if you are just leading your life, perhaps you voted for Trump, you've got a job, you live in the suburbs, whatever, maybe you've got black friends, maybe you don't, whatever, but you're just leading a normal life. If all of a sudden CNN is telling you that you're a Nazi and a white nationalist, at that moment in time, every white male in America just says, I'm out.
Yeah. One of the issues that comes up is you've got a bunch of suburban voters that are trending Democratic because I think they feel particularly subject to those norms because they were subjected to them in college. So the reason I think that non-college educated are more willing to disobey those norms is that they didn't have to live under them for 4 years. And I think that's one of the things that explains some of the bifurcation that you're seeing along those lines, because of course the university system is where the left is at the apex of its cultural and political power. The problem is this, essentially, the left says that they have a vision of an open society, but it just doesn't include a lot of people that are inevitably going to be part of society. My dissertation advisor, who actually just died a few weeks ago, has a book that we're going to get out on the nature of open societies and disagreement and diversity. And one of the points he makes is that the nature of free societies is disagreement. Lots of different kinds of disagreement are just going to be part of our lives. And the thing the left can't accept, I agree with him, and I don't cite that book because it's coming out after mine, but many on the left think that diversity is supposed to all go in one direction. They're supposed to lead to convergence of opinion, to agreement on the true scientific, the rational, the egalitarian But if the nature of free societies is to generate and even amplify disagreement, religious people aren't going to go away. The thought here is that the left's sort of progressivism and their inclusivity are at odds. They say, oh, well, we want to be inclusive, but they say, oh, but we need to agree on these values. And then certain people don't, and so they say they're out of bounds. I think that many on the right are people who felt like that they were excluded from that vision. And yeah, no, a big part of trust in a polarized age is trying to create the conditions where everybody is in a position to where they can trust each other in their institutions. So yeah, no, there's a lot of dysfunction on the left as well. And there's some respects in which I actually will blame the left more than the right, because I think they've taken more initiative in this direction. I see the right's frustrations as mostly a reaction, and that doesn't mean it's irrational or dumb or anything. It just means that many people on the left are the ones pioneering new ways to divide people.
Let me throw one out, and let's see if you've done some homework here. I've been telling this to friends recently. I really perceive the way the political divide is going in America is ultimately we're going to have the men party and the women party.
Yeah. That's just not what you want.
The voting numbers actually show that going that direction.
I wonder, do you think if Nikki Haley were the nominee that this would be happening?
I don't think that you can ever do on the right. I could be wrong, but I don't know if milquetoast candidates are going to work anymore. I think the Bush, Rubio, McCain stuff is done for on the right, because I would think any enterprising politician is going to look at Trump and look at that audience and say, okay, I want to be more like a street fighter than more milquetoast.
Yes. What Trump would say about Romney in that debate where Candy Crowley falsely corrected him about Benghazi, for which he lost her job ultimately, but was that Romney choked in that debate. I think Trump's sense was that Republicans were tired of their leaders being ashamed in front of the more influential and culturally powerful leaders on the left, to doubt themselves, to not actually fight for certain kinds of values. That's how a lot of people on the right are feeling about John Roberts now. I don't think entirely fairly, because I think he plays a much more intelligent long game than people think. But nonetheless, that's the thought. And I think you're right. That is going to be an expectation on the right for people to be good at that. This is one reason I expect if Trump loses, for Tom Cotton to do very well next time, because I think he's been pretty good about trying to be the person to pick up that mantle. So he's willing to hit the left extremely hard. He's willing to deliberately upset their pieties. And he's been sort of testing that out. So you saw the attempt to cancel him with the New York Times because of his editorial about sending the military into some of these protest areas. And then it's revealed that people in the New York Times are tearing each other to pieces because the newer social justice people of the New York Times are out for conformity in a way that the older generation wasn't. I think you're right. That's why I expect someone like Tom Cotton to do well and someone like Rubio to not do well.
To dig in a little bit here on Trump, again, he famously came out with his birther accusations against Obama. Some people are going to say this is racist. Other people are going to say, hold on, he did it to McCain and Cruz as well, and it was a tactic. Okay? The reason I lay it out, I'm trying to say, okay, and then Trump is a playboy billionaire, clearly is not shy of the women. This is the candidate that comes out. Then even before he gets elected, but then once he gets elected, I've been trying to figure out for years now, what in blazes was the true hatred of Trump? Did they really hate his policies? Did they really hate him? Or did all the people that were on the Hillary train who would have been set up for 8 years in D.C., I think what they really hate is they didn't get it. They didn't get the prize. I've been trying to figure out what is the venom towards Trump exactly. If I want to add to that, and I want you to comment, I also look at something like Russia. Okay, Russia takes actions. Russia's probably taken actions over 100 years. So Russia takes actions, but look, most of America knows who they are. They vote Democrat, they vote Republican. So Russia's actions, if they had a chance to affect things, it was literally in swing counties, in swing states.
That didn't pan out. I mean, even the folks on the left looking at the evidence, yeah, they tried to interfere, but it's not obvious they even changed one vote, you know.
Right. And so what I'm getting at is they go, what is the true angst about Trump? Ultimately, for me, it reminds me of growing up in the 80s in high school, and I would look at my Democratic friends, and it often seemed like a jealousy type thing. Like, okay, The Republicans supposedly have money and the Democrats don't. So they're jealous. But here we are now in 2020, and Jeff Bezos is the richest guy in the world. The Google guys are super rich. Everything's flipped on its head. So the old Democratic line of like, well, the Republicans are all these rich guys and corporations. The whole thing is out of whack.
Do you know Rod Dreher's for this? What this phenomenon calls it woke capitalism? The idea is that the rich guys on the left, they get away with being rich because they're happy to be on the sort of identity politics train. I think this helps explain why Trump makes people so angry, is because the current generation of people on the left is that their pieties are built around a certain kind of secular egalitarianism. What they hold as their highest value, the holiest thing for them. I mean, just imagine like instead of a golden calf, a golden equality sign, and a whole bunch of people kind of going around it and worshiping it and so on. And then Trump just comes in and just desecrates it. Because he's seen as a disruptor, a transgressor of communal norms, he set up the whole kind of natural sort of human response to having something sacred being violated. I don't think it's so much that they're wanting these cushy jobs. I mean, they do want that. I think it's more just that Trump is seen as a transgressor of their very highest values. He's practically demonic to them. This is just a case of a lot of folks on the left inheriting a religious impulse from their previous generations, but it's completely secularized now. Instead of surrounding someone like God, it surrounds an ideal like equality. All of their religious energy, all of their intense emotional and spiritual devotion is to this political idea. And Trump is just saying, I'm not going to play ball. I mean, that's, I think, the very deepest part of it is he's seen as a norm transgressor. He's seen as a blasphemer.
I do give you credit. I was unsure when we started talking, going through your book, because I found some of these examples and I thought, well, where is he going to come down? Where's Kevin going to come down? And I give you credit. I think you are an equal opportunity perspective. Because look, how many times can we turn on Fox or a CNN and find balanced perspective? I mean, perhaps something like the old Crossfire would show it. And I find voices out there that I think are getting more at an honest conversation, even if they have their own partisan leanings. For example, 3 come to mind for me. I will look at a guy like a Glenn Greenwald or a Matt Taibbi or a Tucker Carlson. These 3 guys seem to be, even though they've got their partisan perspective, they seem to be trying to be objective.
One of the problems that we're seeing, I think, on the right and on the left is a kind of increasing discomfort with certain aspects of what the sort of philosopher Karl Popper called, but many of us use the term now, the idea of an open society. And the idea of an open society, very roughly, is where people have a lot of different paths or forms of life that they can lead, and they have to make choices, personal decisions between those different things, those different ways of living. For a while, you had the Berkeley free speech movement on the left. Say whatever you want. Now there's practically speech codes at Berkeley. So it's been a generation. There's been this entire flip on the left from saying, oh, no, total free speech to, well, we don't know. You're also seeing this increasingly with freedom of religion, which I think Obama revealed as having certain issues with. I don't know if you remember this, but he tried at one point to pivot from talking about freedom of religion to freedom of worship. That's a much narrower group of things. Freedom of religion is much more than just being able to worship. It's your whole form of life. And there's this sense that the left is closing up. It's become more intolerant. And I think that's absolutely true. I do worry about similar trends on the right, on the intellectual right. So, for instance, if you look at a lot of the sort of new populist thinkers, particularly the Twitter and Facebook discourse surrounding groups like the new Catholic integralists, maybe your kind of Twitter phenomenon that aren't paid as much attention to. But these are folks who say, look, liberal institutions are bad. They atomize society. They destroy community. We need to restrict freedom a whole lot and make sure people are living good and worthwhile lives, even if we have to be kind of paternalistic about it. You see a challenge to the more kind of open, what we call fusionist conservatism of the previous decades, where they kind of combined libertarian and traditional conservative ideas to say, look, we believe in certain Judeo-Christian values, but we also believe in freedom and liberty, and we're deeply committed to that. And I kind of see that on the intellectual right as starting to degrade and erode. In fact, my next book is going to be about that phenomenon because I think it's unfortunate, and I really want to be in conversation with people on the right about it. I want the fusionists to win this intellectual combat. I do see maybe more on the left than the right, but particularly with the right's changing attitude on immigration, the sense that, this hope that we could have a genuinely open society, I feel like a lot of people are really giving up on it. And it worries me. I want to be a true classical liberal, someone who really does believe in these liberal ideas of freedom of religion, free speech, free inquiry, where we can ask questions and make different choices and respect real diversity. And I feel like increasingly I'm on the stage all by myself, and that people are so focused on how much they distrust other people. They're so focused on how bad the other side is that it's very hard for people to step back and say, okay, we've got to live with each other. One of my big things now is just religious conservatives and the LGBT community. They don't always get along, but neither one of them are going away. So how do we organize, for instance, the law so that they can both flourish from their own perspective? That's a question that people don't want to ask.
You mentioned classical liberalism. I was thinking, well, it was kind of before my time, but my alma mater seems to be a hotbed of that. That would be the econ department at George Mason University. A lot of those guys have.
Yeah, I know them.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of some of them.
They've kind of gone down the path. I think I'm up to 6, 7, or 8 George Mason economists on the show.
Oh, yeah, I like their blogs. I know them all. I mean, I love George Mason and everything pretty much that a lot of them are doing. I mean, Tyler, Brian, Robin, Alex, Pete.
Robin is a character.
Yes. We had him out to talk. But there's a bunch of really interesting ideas there.
A couple of his books that I've seen recently, the one about the AI and basically the scanning of the mind, that's fascinating.
He's been important in a really revolutionary way on the right in introducing everyone to signaling theory. I think he did more than anything to lay the intellectual groundwork for a term that he doesn't use, but people on the right use all the time, virtue signaling. My colleague Brandon Warmke puts it grandstanding. They're not the same concept, but they're related. But Robin's view, is more radical in the sense that he says that almost everything we do is because we're trying to signal to others. And I think there is a lot of insight there. What a lot of us are doing now is in-group signaling. We're trying to say, look, we're pure and we're going to beat up on the other side in order to show how pure we are. And to even get people to listen, I feel like to even get people to listen to me, I have to start off by hitting the out-group, and then I can talk to them, and then they'll listen to me. Because I try to talk with anyone who will talk to me, because I want trust in polarized times. That means reaching out to everyone. So no, I think there's dysfunctional kind of anti-open society trends on both sides, but I'm an equal opportunity critic because I think the life in an open society has so many rich advantages. Having a more closed society actually requires a severe amount of repression that I think most people either don't have the stomach for or shouldn't.
To answer one of your questions, though, must politics be war? I think in America today, boy, that trend seems to be set in motion. And as much that you are laying out a scenario where both sides can perhaps look at their weak points and their positive points and try and find some trust, I'm trying to figure out where it's going to happen. Where are these sides going to meet up and have a conversation?
This book is the more sort of accessible version, particularly a lot of the data that I have on trust. The previous volume, Must Politics Be War, was a sort of more philosophical book where I was just trying to show that it was possible to have a non-warlike politics. I mean, that's how skeptical people are. In that book, it was just a kind of proof of concept that you could even have a politics that wasn't inevitable blood sport. Now, if you look at European democracies and Southeast Asian democracies, there's division, but there's, for the most part, a lot less bad than what we have here. Just empirically, you can kind of look and see, okay, well, things aren't always this way in the past, and they aren't this way, say, in Germany right now, although obviously before. But the thought is to try to make clear to people, one, that trust is possible and available to Americans. Two, just to show a huge amount what I do, and I think real value to people in the audience, is just reading chapter 2, which is just the data about what creates trust and what trust creates. And the costs of giving up trust are enormous. I mean, particularly in lost economic growth and prosperity. People can trust each other, they can exchange more often, they can engage in more productivity with each other. But when we lose trust, we lose the ability to have mutual prosperity. So there's all kinds of costs to losing trust that I think people just aren't aware of. So you have to say, look, trust is possible. Here's why we want it, and here are the way to get it. Those are the kinds of things that I'm trying to lay out. But I also say at the very end, look, if people don't want this, it's not going to happen. And I think a lot of people get a lot of meaning in their lives from fighting the other side. It goes all the way back, I think, way back into evolutionary time, where you needed to be able to motivate people in the tribe to be willing to kill and die in order to protect the tribe from another tribe. I think that that's what's active right now. That's what's in people's minds. It's not, let's hunt a mammoth together so that we can feed everybody. That's not the attitude. The attitude is this bonobo group is trying to wipe out and kill the other one. The question is, how do we activate the different part of our mentality? How do we activate that cooperative part and deactivate that conflictual, competitive spirit of domination, right, and defeat? That's what I'm trying to do. And so, yeah, I have to sometimes go slow and be very careful with the data because I just want to show people that this is something we can accomplish and that it's something we ought to want. But again, Americans, I think a lot of them don't want it right now because the force for meaning in their lives is that I'm on team blue or I'm on team red. And I think people need to find other things to do with their lives so they see the benefits of cooperation a little more clearly.
Can I give you my hack to this problem that we've talked about for an hour? My hack is quite simple. I tend to believe that at some stage of the game, America won't be one country, that perhaps there will be some breakaways and some of the states will become countries. I think that could happen. Maybe not in my lifetime, but I can imagine it. My solution in my lifetime with the limited time that I have is to choose to spend most of my time in a homogenous country. Because I have found over the last 6, 7, 8 years that being in a homogenous country where everyone seems like they're brothers and sisters, there's no violence on the street, there's no great conflict, that if I come into that homogenous country and I respect the norms, I find it's much more peaceful. I don't know if we're going to get to the things that you hope we're going to get to. The issue becomes is, do I stay around and fight, or do I enjoy my life in a homogenous society where we don't have all that?
Yeah, I mean, I actually have mixed feelings about this because on the one hand, I would like lots more federalism, and I would even be open. I even have a paper that I didn't put my views about secession in the book, but I actually think that, yeah, at some point we're going to need smaller countries because the United States is huge. Alabama has half as many people as Sweden. It could function perfectly fine on its own. There's no in principle reason that we couldn't have a variety of different countries, and it might be better. However, one of the things that my advisor was working on was looking at moral disagreement earlier in evolutionary history. It looks like there's still a lot of it. It may be the case that even if you have a homogeneous society, that there are certain dynamics that are going to drive controversy there too. Part of me is kind of worrying that even if we found the homogeneous community, it wouldn't be homogeneous for long. Part of me thinks, okay, look, we still got to be interacting a whole lot with people who are different from us, because otherwise we're just going to eventually reproduce the same thing in our home territory. I'm just trying to think about what's the empirical truth about that. If we have the homogeneous communities, will we just end up back where we started? I don't know. I like to think that if with some more decentralization, we could do a lot better than we're doing now. And I still believe that. My greatest regret about the book is that I didn't get to talk about federalism because there's too little trust data on federalism. I just couldn't do enough on it. Although, I mean, Yuval Levin is making the case now in The Time to Build that trust is a lot higher at the local level. You can do more if you have more localism. And I really wish I'd been able to fit that into the book. But I think that there is a lot to what you're saying. So I have some reservations. I worry. Well, I think we do need to interact with people who think differently. Note I say think differently.
We've given a good round. People will have to dig into your world, your work, your books. The newest one, Trust in a Polarized Age, available on Amazon, all that kind of fun stuff. Hey, Kevin, is there a website you want to send people to? Where can we direct people?
I have a blog called Reconciled. You can see from the conversation a theme. I want people to come together. I want there to be peace. You just go to my first and last name.com/reconciled, kevinvallier.com/reconciled. And I do short blog posts on this stuff. I'm a philosopher by training, and a lot of my work is philosophical, but I'm very committed to engagement on social media, Facebook, Twitter, blogs, to talking about these ideas in a way that people don't have to necessarily have a philosophy background to get. I think the importance of philosophy is being able to make your arguments precise and sound. But the reason I appeal to all the empirical data is because there's all kinds of people that have great stuff to say and great stuff to add that aren't in my profession. In fact, especially outside of my profession, maybe with the trends in it. So I want to talk to everybody. I want to have a conversation. I want to learn more about where people are coming from, what makes them tick, not to dismiss anyone right off. There are certain troubling things in politics, but I try very hard never to be unfair to people's perspectives. So yeah, I just invite people to interact with me on Facebook, Twitter, or my blog, Reconciled.
Awesome stuff. I appreciate the conversation. Again, as I said at the top, and maybe this is because I had an episode go sideways a few months back. It was unexpected. It was at the end of a conversation, and I started saying something about crime statistics. And the next thing I know, my guest kind of broke down and accused me of being a racist. And I was like, whoa, 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 where's this coming from? I was like, my first moment in 900 episodes over 8 years where I had a triggering moment, and it kind of shocked me. So now every time I have a political conversation, I'm kind of trying to ferret out, is this one going to get a little dicey? What do I have to be concerned with?
So the weird thing about me is I like to say is that I work with progressives, I worship with conservatives, and I internet with libertarians. My whole life is just a constant confrontation with political difference. Just in a single day, I can interact with people who have wildly different perspectives. And I like to think that I've grown pretty tolerant as a result. In fact, a lot of my friends on all sides of the political spectrum think I tolerate the other side way too much. And they'll say, oh, you're really a liberal, or oh, you're really a Trump supporter. And I just say, look, I just try to say the things I think are true. I don't think I'm an especially virtuous person, but I think my weird circumstances, just being surrounded by difference, I've been able to kind of take more people seriously than most people do. So I think that's a pretty important vocation for at least some people to have.
Well, listen, great stuff. I've kept you longer than I should have, but I appreciate you coming on. I hope you enjoyed it.
I'm glad you were able to draw me out a little bit more. I wasn't quite sure what to expect. I love getting into the details. I follow politics, tell people it's my sports. I don't watch football. I watch Fox and MSNBC. I love to talk about this stuff. I have opinions on this kind of stuff. I'm trying to carve out a perspective where I can sort of hit everybody, but also be nice to everybody at the same time. It's very, very hard to do. I see you picking up on the choices I made in the book about who to hit, and I'm now kind of wanting to go back and hit the other side a little bit more. But I know I'm going to talk to other people and I'm going to be like, you really should have been harder on Trump. You can't make everybody happy, but
from a background perspective, my podcast got very diverse from trading books, so I have all kinds of people on like yourself. But back in a past life, I was a politics and government major at George Mason. I ran for political office at age 21 in the Washington, D.C. area in Northern Virginia. I had a chance early on to see at a visceral level how politics worked. I had a chance to see my freedom of information request being kiboshed. I had a chance to see local politicians acting bad. I had a chance to see local media acting bad. So I feel like on a living perspective, not necessarily on the academic side, I feel like I've had a chance to see behind the curtain. So whenever I have a conversation with someone like you, I feel like I can make it interesting. I feel like I can drive us to places to get things out.
I like that you're able to do that. I mean, I think I have tried to find my way in being an academic and a pretty theologically traditional Christian at the same time, and someone who really loves markets. Has hung out with a lot of libertarians and has done college libertarian activism and votes libertarian a lot of the time. For me, it's just all a matter of trying to balance these different perspectives, but it's so hard to talk to multiple people. But it sounds like you've been in a position where you've seen a lot of different perspectives and behaviors as well. Maybe you're a little more cynical than I am, but no, I appreciate you're not kind of walled off as so many people are. In America, it's just easier for them to handle their lives if they count on one perspective, because who wants to get hated on? Who wants to get insulted and degraded by the other side, right?
Yeah. Kevin, great stuff. Appreciate you coming on.
Delighted to be here. Thanks so much for the conversation. Glad we were able to really get knee deep and passionate about some issues.
I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.